I'm Mattie Toia. I'm a director of production engineering at Shopify, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about a phenomenon that I've observed throughout my career, and I like to call it emergent organizational failure. And in particular, I want to really talk about the mental disconnections that we have that lead to these kinds of failures where, despite our best intentions at getting things reliable, at making change, we just can't seem to make progress. But before I really get into the meat of my presentation, I want to level set a couple of things. We're going to talk a lot about something like reliability leadership. And what might come to mind is people like me who are directors in your organization. But I really think there's a lot more reliability leadership that goes on in SRE and beyond that we should consider when we start thinking about these topics and talking about them. When we talk about reliability, SRE is obviously included in it, but we also need to consider folks who are working on infrastructure of all kinds, people working on your developer experience, people who are end-to-end owners of the products and services that really care about the customer experience at the end of the day. And when we talk about leadership, of course your formal leaders are going to be included in that, but also there will be all sorts of contributors on the technical side of things. And even if you're junior or more new into your organization, anytime you have an opportunity to make a decision about reliability or the direction you want to take with some work that you have an opportunity to demonstrate leadership. And so I hope that you can take some of the discussions today and apply them into your context. And the other thing I want to level set on is something that probably everyone here is a bit familiar with, which is emergence. And now, when we talk about emergence, we're talking about the subtle inputs that combine together to create some sort of non-obvious outcome or whole at the end of the day. And I think SREs are particularly good at observing emergent behavior in systems. It's kind of like that analysis that really makes us special. It's kind of what our job is at its core. And I think it's because fundamentally reliability itself is an emergent property, right? You can't just go and implement reliability like you could implement a login page or integration with some sort of checkout system or whatever. It really is the culmination of a lot of different things that you do both in technology and inside of your organizations that lead to your systems to feel reliable at the end of the day. Okay, now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's get into these disconnections. Here are the 5 things we're going to talk about today. And each of these, as I said before, is a kind of subtle input that leads to non-obvious outcomes, right? These are things where there's a seed of good intent that leads people to actually want to go in a certain direction, but ultimately don't get us to where we want to be when it comes to something like reliability. I'm going to start at the first one and kind of work my way through in order because there's actually some secondary characteristics that link these together that I think is important in our understanding and thinking about them. So let's start with number 1. So disconnection number 1, believing that there is a definitive production to be focused on. We all know that engineering is a limited resource, right? We only have so many people and so much time to get things done. And so as humans, we try to evaluate our systems and think about what's most important, what's most critical or impactful for us to work on. But in particular, this disconnection takes the form of a couple of things. The first is that there's actually an inherent difficulty of understanding what's really important, right? We just talked about how there's this emergent behavior and that it's often hard to understand how specific things we do will affect the outcomes at the end of the day. But even more importantly than that, once we decide that something is critical and important, we develop a sort of tunnel vision about it, right? We start to focus on it to the extent that we start to ignore other things. We need to avoid this tunnel vision. So I'll ask a couple of maybe thought-provoking questions. Maybe you've thought about these before, maybe you've encountered these before, but would you consider your deployment tool or process part of your production environment? Some people would. Early on in my career, I was working on a safety-critical application, the kind of thing where if stuff goes wrong, people's lives are at stake, and all sorts of bad stuff goes down. And so our approach to trying to create a sense of reliability was that we would literally hand test every function, feature, and part of our product in front of our customers on the exact hardware, in the exact cabinets, in the exact way that it's going to be used, to demonstrate that nothing unpredictable could happen. It would be impossible for something unpredictable to happen. And of course, we're sitting there doing one such set of tests, and the screens all go blank. The whole system goes down. And the reason is that someone happened to be sitting at the workstation that we used for deployment and inadvertently just decided to reinstall the whole system. So complete outage for about 20 minutes would have been a terrible thing had this not been during a test, and it really caused us to reevaluate our own tunnel vision about what was important. Now you might say, okay, well, Mattie, that's obviously changing production. It's your actuation. It's doing a whole bunch of stuff. So that seems like it should be part of your production, right? And so now we're smarter, and we can consider that part of production. Well, then I'd say, well, do you consider your source control system part of production? And I'm not just talking about, does production work when your source control is down? I think most of us have enough experience to know that, yeah, we should probably test that and turn off source control and make sure things still run. But are you considering the relationship you have between shipping code and configuration changes from source control to production as a part of your architecture itself? Or is it just sort of an incidental relationship that you have between the tools and vendors that you've selected to provide these services? Something to think about. I could ask another dozen of these kinds of questions, of course, because quite frankly, everything contributes to emergent behavior, right? Everything, the software that you're using, the operating system you're running on, the hardware itself, the temperature in your data center, where that data center happens to be, the cosmic rays from the sun, right? Is the cosmic rays from the sun part of your production system? And this becomes a challenge because we know we just can't focus on everything, right? If everything is important, then nothing is. And we face this sort of dilemma where we need to figure out what's important, but we can't just take shortcuts in that action, right? We need to create a context for what is important and have that context be a living, breathing thing that can change over time. And really what it comes down to is being good at prioritization. But prioritization is exactly where the next disconnection I want to talk about is. Disconnection number 2, missing how hard prioritization is. I truly feel that prioritization when it comes to working on reliability is somewhat of a unique thing, right? There's been books written about prioritization in software engineering for ages, and all sorts of different methodologies you might take to get this done. But because reliability itself is an emergent property, there are some specific challenges that make prioritization difficult, right? We have long cycle times in order to evaluate the impact of the changes that we're making. Oftentimes, we have unintended consequences when we take actions that we think will lead to success. Finally, our understanding of our systems changes over time, and along with that, the systems themselves change. Bad planning and bad prioritization can lead to almost a vicious cycle of apathy in your teams, where people don't feel connected to the prioritization and the work that needs to get done, and then continue to do less and less thinking about what is actually important in the work. Ultimately, behind the scenes, each of us who works on systems or reliability has some kind of mental model about how things work, or at least how they're supposed to work. And what we try to do at kind of a sort of primal level is develop our focus from these mental models. But reality check, each of our mental models is incomplete. And there's a lot of reasons for this, of course, right? The aforementioned tunnel vision I talked about from our first disconnection. Perhaps there's a lack of context. Perhaps you haven't worked in this particular part of a system before, and yet you need to make some calls about what's important and how to prioritize. Perhaps there's insufficient evidence of past results because we're trying to do something that's new or innovative. Perhaps it's just because there are just challenges in observing complex systems. How many talks do we have this past few days about observability in different forms? It's a hard thing to do. If we want to make prioritization effective, we need to use collaboration techniques to improve our mental models. And what we really want to get to, if we want to talk about a gold standard, is to a place where we have shared mental models, a shared state of how things are supposed to work together to create these outcomes at the end of the day. And what I'd ask is that when we go into a discussion about prioritization, do we show up asking for things? Do we show up with what we want? Or do we show up to start having a conversation about what we know? We really need to spend more time understanding each other and understanding our systems if we want to get things done. We should be focusing on a process that facilitates communication and context building as the first step in prioritization. Even more than that, as we work, we learn about the systems we're working on. And if we're learning things, we might need to change our priorities. But how often are the ways that we set priorities difficult to change once they've been established? We have this concept of a blameless postmortem process, right? We also need a blameless prioritization process, a way to say that we can make mistakes in our prioritization, and as we learn, to change them as we go forward. Ultimately, what we're looking for is setting the right goals, right? We want to get to a place where we can set the right goals for the work that we need to do in order to improve the reliability of a system. But that itself can sometimes be very challenging. And it gets us to our third disconnection here. Disconnection number 3, having unrealistic goals instead of sustainable ones. Now, many goals out there are very unrealistic, right? You know, who's heard the phrase 100% reliability is the wrong target, right? I know probably some people have seen it before. I have a sticker on my laptop that says it, right? Well, you know, if your service can't handle 2 nines of reliability, it's just as unrealistic as 100% reliability, right? At least 100% reliability might sound better. And over the years, I've seen many examples of unrealistic goals when it comes to reliability, and there are common themes that have emerged in the way that we talk about them that I think are worth examining. Oftentimes, they focus way too much on the solution rather than the problem that needs to be solved. So an example might be the statement, no more global rollouts. We're not going to have no more global rollouts. They're absolute rather than relative to the current state. You know, we got to get to 5 nines reliability. Well, do we have 4 nines now? Do we have 1 9? Do we have 9 5s? Where are we? There's a broken connection between the time it might take to complete the goal and the expectation as to when it can be delivered. Our customers are irate. We need to get this reliability situation under control by the end of the quarter. Do we have people for that? How bad is it? It can become very unrealistic. The final thing that I've noticed about these, though, that does seem to be pretty consistent is that often there's a recency bias when we have unrealistic goals, that they're a reaction to a sense of urgency brought on by a set of problems that have happened recently in time. The problem with unrealistic goals is it leads to a demotivation of your teams, the sense that things cannot be achieved, and that demotivation leads to a letter of the law type implementation for a lot of the inputs that are supposed to create the emergent whole of reliability. The realism of a goal is not related to the need. I had an experience where I was part of a platform-wide sense of urgency around stability. We needed to fix things across many different products in a relatively rapid way. And it kind of checked all the boxes I just said. You know, it was very focused on the solutions. There was tight timelines. We just had a string of bad outages, so we felt that urgency. And I'll be honest with you, it was really hard to push back on unrealistic goals in this sense. It was really hard to push back because they actually sounded good. When you heard them and you said to yourself, well, actually, if we could get there, if we could get that done, that would be a really great place to be from a service perspective, from a product perspective. And even when the sense of like maybe there was some unrealism in these goals started to set in, it was still hard to argue with them because there was a sense of like, well, if we shoot for the moon, maybe we can land among the stars, right? That we could get somewhere good even if we don't achieve the final goal. But what happened in practice? Right? What happened in practice was that progress slowed and people started to panic. People started to cut scope aggressively. They took a big circle and said, this is production, everything else outside of it isn't. We have our tunnel vision. Eventually, folks just started giving up on the goal, on the spirit of the goal to really actually satisfy our customers' needs for reliability. And instead, we're finding very literal ways to implement things to achieve the stated goals in our priorities. This went on for quite a while. And in the end, the results felt quite hollow. And ultimately, there was another string of bad outages, and we kind of began again. I think that picking realistic goals is hard because we cannot calibrate from our experience. The right goals contribute to success. But for reliability, we have some challenges when we start to evaluate our success and our failure. First of all, our outcomes are distant from our actions, right? We might do something that we think is going to help things, but the amplitude of that change might be greater or smaller than we anticipate because of system effects. The second problem is things that I like to call results beyond our patience. How long are we willing to wait to evaluate the progress that we've made before we move on to the next thing? If we make a dramatic change and suddenly the pagers are silent, how do we know the difference between that we actually fix things or that we're just getting lucky? It's very hard to tell sometimes. One of my favorite books is The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge, and I kind of call it a secret SRE book. It's generally about systems thinking in organizations, but there's a lot of applicability here. And specifically, Senge describes this phenomenon as the delusion of learning from experience. He classifies it as an organizational learning failure. And fundamentally, learning is really important for us to sort of zero in on the capabilities of our organization, of our teams, and our technology in order to set realistic goals. So what are we going to do? I strongly feel that sustainable goals ultimately are about progress instead. And this is a subtle shift, right? This is something that we talk about when we want to shift culture at the end of the day. We might take my example from earlier, right? No more global rollouts, and reframe it as, let's make configuration changes safer. What's the difference? It sounds a bit semantic. But the latter approach actually allows those closer to their software, closer to their systems, to take the context of the mental models that they've already built up, that understanding that allows them to prioritize effectively, and bring it to bear in a way that jumping to the solutions will not. There's a serious caveat with this, though, a serious concern we have to be aware of, and that's we can only actually move to this approach if we can really have teams that are effective in the execution over long periods of time. And that brings us to our fourth disconnection. Treating your organization as simple instead of complex. Humans are incredibly hard to predict, and yet we disregard that all the time. Control is all about trying to make humans predictable. And at work, we see this take many forms. We have chain of command, standard operating procedures, we have playbooks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But let's be honest, people are going to be people. Either intentionally or not, they're going to break the rules, right? And furthermore, I'd ask, do we really want rote performance from the people that we're trusting with the reliability of our systems? Or do we want that innovation and creativity, that dynamic response to the problems that we have? And if that's what we want, is command and control really the approach that's going to get us these sustainable goals, these ways that we can make progress on an emergent problem like reliability? Despite this, right, despite this sort of seemingly simple statement, leaders push for command and control all the time. And I think this comes from a sense of needing to determine your own worth, to sort of prove yourself as a real leader by having tangible impact that can be traced all the way back to you. You might picture yourself as the captain of a ship with your hand on the wheel, commanding your crew to get across the water in the storm and make it to shore safely. Or perhaps you go down with the ship. I don't know. I don't like this metaphor very much. I think a better metaphor would be to think of yourself as a gardener, right? A gardener takes a seed, which is already coated with everything that's necessary to grow a plant, knows how to do that from the start. And as a gardener, your job is to create the right environment, light, water, soil, the right context for that seed to do what it was meant to do. We want to create the right environment for our team's best work to emerge. We can start with a simple message, right? Simple messages are good because they can be adapted, right? They don't try to force a particular vision. They allow that dynamic response. We need to recognize when command and control is needed. We often have tactical responses that are necessary. Sometimes we need to call a code red. But if we call a code red and that lasts for 3 months, we have to ask ourselves, are we missing the real strategic opportunities to our approach that would lead to much better results and much less burnout of our team and more sustainable progress when we talk about something like reliability? And this all sounds well and good, but of course, we need a mechanism to keep all this on track, right? We need a mechanism to help us do the right thing when we're allowing for all this autonomy. Fundamentally, I believe that that means that moving the needle is going to mean moving the culture. Culture is a self-sustaining feedback loop for organizations. And if we want to make sustained progress over a long period of time at a challenging goal around reliability, then we need to have that feedback loop of good culture to get us there. Let's talk a bit about how we think. This is kind of a classical model of cognition. At the surface level, we have what we would call automatic thoughts. These are our first reactions, our snap judgments, the things that just pop into our minds. And these come from a place below it of rules and lessons that we've learned, the things that we've gotten from authority figures in our lives, from books, from teachers, from our families. And finally, below that, we have our core beliefs and our values, right? Our core beliefs and our values are really what makes up our person. They're from pivotal moments that define ourselves. Now this sounds, I know, it says like super lofty, psychobabble perhaps, but perhaps I can give you a work example that'll bring a little bit of realism to this, right? Let's say there's a rule that you have at your work that's don't ship on Fridays, right? Does anyone have that rule at your office? Maybe, maybe not. Don't ship on Fridays. What the core belief underneath that might be is that you say, well, I value my own personal time and I value my peers' personal time and I don't want to interrupt their weekends. And that's my core belief because personal time is important. And so you like that rule, you adopt it, you think it's great. Maybe you have a different core belief. Maybe your core belief is that the only way to be successful is to move fast. And so you hate this rule because it doesn't help you move fast and you reckon against it. Ultimately, if we want to change culture in our organizations, we really need to be working with each other to adopt and adapt values and core beliefs that underpin all of this thinking. But that requires trust, right? That requires trust. And that also takes us to our fifth and final disconnection. Using incentives as a replacement for dedication. Now, a lot of SRE's organizations I know have sort of a pyramid of needs, and sort of the bottom of the pyramid is always like, keep the site up, or something like that, right? Keep the site up. And that's a heavy responsibility, I think, right? And it's not just a reactive responsibility as well, it's a proactive one, right? To keep the site up means to do things in advance of the problems that we can have. But as several of my colleagues who have stood up here before me to this very week have said, how do you get recognition for the outage that doesn't happen, right? Often this is a thankless job. And despite that, despite it being a thankless job, SREs actually have a lot of pride in their work. I found time and time again that there's this sense of service that SREs have. Is that a table stake for being an SRE, for working on reliability? I don't know about that. Incentives are rewards for doing specific things, right? They're transactional in nature. And the transactional thinking that is driven from incentives can lead to a situation where either side can stop transacting at any moment they choose. Dedication isn't really doing a specific thing. Dedication is about doing the right thing. But if you want to build that into your organization, again, you need this trust, and trust is tricky. At Shopify, we have this metaphor we like to use called the trust battery, right? It's this idea that there's this potential energy that we have either between ourselves and someone else, or between two organizations, between yourself and an organization, or whatever. But it's this source of energy that can be charged over time through the actions that you take. And the idea is that if you have built up enough charge in your trust battery, that you can do things that you otherwise might not be able to do if you didn't have that trust. It's just a metaphor, but I think it illustrates a point here. Actions are imperative to building trust. When we think about building trust, we need to start with listening, right? We need to start with listening to each other, but we need to get to action ultimately. And even if you're junior or new into your role, this is still very applicable to you. Look to your peers, right? A sort of saying I grew up with was, if you want to make a friend, you got to be a friend. Well, if you want trust, you got to give trust. You have to build that in your community. Actions charge the trust battery. But oftentimes these actions need to go beyond just business, right? We're all humans here. And humans have a lot of different needs that start to influence those core beliefs and values that I talked about. At a personal level, families grow, people pass away, people move across the country or perhaps across the world. People come out at work. At a macro level, we've been dealing with a pandemic for the past few years. We're dealing with environmental issues, political issues, violence, strife. Each of these events are shaping our core beliefs and our values. And yet, so often we forget that we can take actions in our places of work that influence people and build trust when it comes to them. Let's bring this a little bit closer to the work, though. Does the team, particularly the team responsible for reliability, believe that their services bring harm or good into the world? Now, technology isn't neutral, but I'm not up here to say what's good or bad. I think it's very subjective to say what's good or bad. But I will say that if your team is expressing concerns about harm, that you need to listen and you need to take action if you really care about trust. SREs care deeply. They care deeply about these things. And I think there's some reasons why. SREs make systems real. We're the ones who put things into production and make the queries flow. We also understand the importance of community and collective because oftentimes we're dealing with a scale where one single person's actions can't alone keep the system running. And finally, SREs make connections. We're all really great systems thinkers. Oftentimes we're the harbinger of things to come. What you make and how you build it will either create or erode trust. And if we want to get back to the subject of dedication, we have to ask ourselves, do people trust that doing the right thing will be recognized? Ultimately, you may be put in a situation in your career, a true dilemma of whether doing the right thing for the work and the right thing from your career might be two different things. We've already established that there's a serious attribution challenge when it comes to reliability work. When we talk about incentivizing people, we need to recognize that incentivized people will do what they are incentivized to do. But dedicated people will do what is right because it is the right thing. Unless you think that you can be perfect in the definition of what incentivizing is, I think you're way better off at focusing on dedication. And when you see someone doing the right thing, even if it's a little outside the box, you really need to recognize it and reward it. And so that's where I want to end. These are the 5 disconnections and my 5 recommendations on how you might want to consider a response to them. I don't know if each of these is going to be applicable to your organization or where you sit in them, but what I will say is that I hope that they inspire you to take a look around at what's going on and see how they might be applicable to the way that you go and engage in your companies. Thank you.